Germans of Reddit, how was Adolf Hitler taught in your school? In general, you come back to WW2 and the Holocaust several times during school. I read Anne Frank's diary in religion class in I think 7th grade. Hitler's rise to power and the Holocaust usually are taught in 8th, 9th and again in 12th grade. However, you might analyze some speeches or the political system during other classes than history too. Edit. Since some pointed out that this is only the way that it was taught, here's the explanation of what we were taught. During early years you learn how evil Hitler and the Nazis were. How many people died because of them and what the Holocaust was. Then you might learn what that meant on an individual level for Jews, Anne Frank's diary. As you go further you learn how the Nazis came to power, why Germans voted for them and how the propaganda worked. Finally you start to analyze the conditions that made regular people become mass murderers or fanatical soldiers of the Third Reich. As you can see, you start with a clear black-white image, then learn why they came into power and finally question yourself if you could have been one of those people and how to prevent such a thing from ever happening again. Alongside this you might visit a concentration camp. I myself visited Buchenwald and Hadamar, a euthanasia site, in which for example disabled people were killed. Alongside this you might analyze speeches, art or songs of that period in different classes. This was my experience. I went to school in a couple of different South German cities, Munich, Heidelberg and Stuttgart. Starting in 8th grade onwards, we really seemed to focus on the Industrial Revolution and after. The last quarter of the school year was always focused on World War II with some pretty short, oh yeah, then we were split into two countries and that was bad. Reunification happened in the 90s. The older we got, the more detailed it tended to become. One of my graduation topics in German literature was exile poetry. There were at least 2 excursions to concentration camps built into the curriculum, Dachau in grade 8 or 9, and then Auschwitz-Birkenau during our senior trip. I went on neither trip because I realized pretty quickly I didn't want to be around a bunch of middle schoolers who only knew one Jewish person, me, in a concentration camp. The second one happened during Yom Kippur, which seemed oddly fitting. Well, we first got taught about the WW1 and then went into how Hitler started. As a small boy, how he got into politics, etc. Then WW2 and the Holocaust. After that we went to a Konzentrationslager concentration camp near Berlin. It was truly heartbreaking walking around there and seeing everything. Seeing the gas chambers, the beds, the clothes and the numbers they were given instead of their names. We even met someone who survived the KZ. I can't even imagine what he went through. That sounds very rough to go through a KZ. We never had a chance to do that. But we went to Bunker Valentin next to Bremen where a factory for submarines was planned. Also the prisoner camp called Sandbostel where the workers was held under pretty bad circumstances, especially the Russian ones. We heard stories about their food were made out of wood shavings. My great-grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She had the number tattoo and all. I tried asking her about it while she was alive, but if you asked her anything about it she would stare off for a bit and then change the subject. We have him in school now. I'm from Germany. Well, basically he is taught to us in a very neutral way. We learn how he seized power, started the Second World War, etc. But when it comes to the very bad things like killing of millions of Jews, teachers usually say how bad he was. I learned half a year of 9th grade about him and the Nazi regime. Now we have him in the second half of the 11th grade. So we learn a lot about the Nazis. Actually, BC, the government doesn't want us to forget the brutal past. We have him in school now. Wait, he's there in your class with you. Deleted. I'm Austrian, but I guess that still counts. Also, please feel free to correct me on any grammatical, spelling errors, as English is not my first language. We're covering WW2 right now actually. First we learned about WW1 and its aftermath, then about how Hitler gained power and how he became Chancellor. Our current topic is the Anschluss. We've watched a video of one of Hitler's speeches and next year we're going to go on an excursion to Mauthausen to see the KZ concentration camps there. I've read the diary of Anne Frank, but we're not reading it at school. My teacher does teach the lessons neutrally, I think, but sometimes, like for example when we watched the video of Hitler's speech or when we were talking about the deportation of Jewish people, she puts emphasis on how horrible this era of history truly was. I guess that if we didn't have an idea of how much people suffered during this time and how many lives the war cost, history would be much more likely to repeat itself. Your grammar and spelling is better than my English teacher's. I live in America. As English is not my first language. Proceeds to use better English than 99% of native English speakers. Maybe it helps that English is a Germanic language, relatively closely related. Our history classes were very chronologically all through high school. And by the time we reached World War II you were clearly old enough to know about Hitler and World War II, so our history classes were really quite neutral and focused on facts and backgrounds. However, the topic of World War II, Hitler and the committed atrocities by the Nazi regime popped up in other classes basically from beginning of high school, even primary school. You'd read stories or books about it, watch movie clips, go to exhibitions etc. When that topic was talked about in those classes it was more about all the horrors that were inflicted by the Nazi regime, what it meant to the people at that time, both victims and followers, and a very critical reflection and analysis on why this could happen and how to prevent it from happening again. In the end the subtext of all these classes were a lot about ethics, morals, human behavior, human faults, human inhumanity, realizing your own shortcomings and the responsibility you had to understand what happened, how it happened and to prevent it from happening. Obviously, the way things were taught and talked about were very different depending which age you were as a kid. But, you have to realize that for Germans you usually don't learn about the Nazi past in school, but you just know it before. It's on TV a lot, magazine covers etc. Sometimes you still have older relatives who lived in that time. My grandparents were in their 20s during World War II, so I knew from them. But for me, school sort of brought all the snippets that I knew together and formed a bigger picture and made me understand a lot of things. I'd also like to hear from other people in Europe. Specifically Polish, Czechs, Austrians, Hungarians, and Slovaks edit. Also, if you want to talk about your history classes in general that's okay too. Americans learn a lot about America's history and unless you're a historian who specializes in Western or Eastern Europe, or Scandinavia, or Africa, South America, Asia, or Oceanic, or wherever, then you don't learn a lot about other places. Something that might be basic knowledge for you might be totally new information for someone else. Hungarian who went to a very liberal Jewish high school here. In class it was definitely approached a lot more objectively. Attending Holocaust memorials and studying in a building that was literally used to hide Jewish families during the war kind of taught us about the brutalities without our teachers going into much detail about it. Check here and I don't know what more to tell you. Our curriculum is almost identical to that of Germans. We are taught about both world wars and Hitler in middle school and then again in high school in more detail. And we don't stop there, after the war we were forced to be a part of the Soviet Union and we get taught about that too. It's probably the last thing you learn in history in high school and it's mostly negative of course. He didn't go to my school. I copied off his test once, he had the solution for the final. So how's art school? I'm not German, in fact, I'm Japanese. I lived and worked in Germany in the 1950s. The country was still in its rebuilding stages and the evidences of the horrible carnage the country suffered was all over. I became good friends with a few Germans who lived in the same neighborhood I did. They became friendly with me upon learning that I was of Japanese descent and they sort of looked at me as an ally of theirs. We talked about the war and Hitler and a couple of my friends were quite open with me extolling the good that Hitler had done for Germany. After World War I Germany was in pretty bad shape. They told me about how Hitler came upon the scene and he rebuilt the country and brought pride to the people of their new prosperity. To a man they denounced the treatment of the Jews but a few of them repeated some of the old suspicions of the Jewish people that Germans held before and during the war. Upon their asking, I related to them how my relatives in Japan were taken in by the nationalistic rhetoric of the times there but now regretted their country's turn to its militarism. Like the Germans who told of how the country was brought up from its poverty after World War I to its new prosperity, my relatives related how life improved for them with the new regime that, unfortunately, led them to World War II and their new misery. Both my German friends and my relatives in Japan were taken in by their leaders and never envisioned the horror of the events that followed. My grandparents are Austrian, and the Holocaust absolutely breaks their hearts, because they really truly believed Hitler was turning things around. The propaganda was very real. If I'm allowed to ask, how old are you? As I also stated in a comment of mine, Hitler didn't become popular because of the horrors he did, he became popular because of what good he did for the economy and the people and what he promised he would do. Thank you for telling us what you saw and heard. Op posts a question to Germans. Every American in the room pipes up to answer. Weird timing to reach Germans, too. Case in point. I'm sipping my morning coffee. Question was asked around midnight in our time zone. Lengthily and structurally. No focus on the person but rather the systems and causalities that lead to him taking and consolidating power, starting with World War I. I think if you'd wake me at 3 in the morning now, almost 20 years later, and ask me what made Europe the powder keg it was at the start of the 20th century, I'll still be able to mumble out militarism, nationalism and imperialism in a matter of seconds. Also, yes, that makes, thinking about, the US, right, now, a tad, uncomfortable edit. By the way, because I just remembered that teaching requirements in the US may vary. If you want to teach history, or any other subject, in Germany you basically need the equivalent of an US master's degree in that subject. My history teacher in 12th grade even had a PhD in history, public school, rather rural area. American HS teacher here. In my state they just removed the graduate requirement because they couldn't find enough teachers. Yeah, they did that instead of raise the amount they pay us. That's kind of awesome. I like the idea of teachers having a high degree in order to teach something like history. Unlike one of my HS history teachers who not only was racist, but an idiot too. German school history in a nutshell, at least mine. Half a year ancient Greeks and Romans, half a year Middle Ages, rest of school career. WW1, Treaty of Versailles, NS Germany. It was the dominant topic in school. Hitler was treated the way he was, everything on the table. We even went on a multi-day trip to visit a concentration camp, Dachau. WAAAAAIT a minute you didn't learn about the French Revolution a gazillion times. So much French Revolution. So much French Revolution. 90% of my history classes were Nazi stuff followed by French Revolution followed by Nazi stuff followed by French Revolution etc. etc. In my case it was taught severely. Not just in history class but also in ethics class or philosophy. Also not just in 1 year, moreover all my secondary school time, 5th grade to 13th grade. In history we learned about the political structures that led to WW1 and therefore to WW2. In philosophy we discussed about how we think we would behave in such a regime. In ethics we watched movies like Clockwork Orange or The Experiment. My school also had a trip to Dachau. It was awful to say at least. But I think it's important for every German to go to a KZ at least once. There is no law or something like that but most schools I know of do a trip with their older pupils. Also not school in particular but on our TV history channels, N24, NTV, do a lot and I mean a lot. Of WW2 documentaries. In every major city I know of are a lot of museums, Mahndenkmäler, memorials of shame I guess, and memorials for couraged people like Die Weiße Rose, the White Rose who fought against the regime. There are daily reminders who are important especially because we have a newish racist party who gains more and more power. That's really scary like the people learned nothing. My teacher actually got really uncomfortable teaching just because I was German. One time she even took me out of the room which was really unnecessary. That's just kinda racist. Germans today aren't any more or less Nazis than anyone else. Your teacher was an idiot. I think most of the schools in Germany really do a good job teaching us about the history of our country. I mean there is a reason Germans are not really proud to be German, although nowadays we can. Of course we learned about concentration camps and all of the other horrible things. Our teacher made it very visual with pictures and recordings of speeches. It really stuck with me. It was very upsetting and maybe sometime a lot to drop on young kids. But what I found very important is that we learned a lot about how he even got the power and what little things went wrong in the very beginning. And we tried to make connections to things happening today all around the world. It made all of us very aware of those details and problems and me and my friends often talk about it. So although Germany has such a bad history we try not to forget it and school constantly confronts the students. I mean it is probably not like that everywhere but it should. We are proud of not being proud. I am from Austria and I was told how he became powerful and what he did in order to get there etc. Well most of the things you need to know about the topic. But as I visited Hartheim I got told a bit more. Hartheim was the location of a concentration camp for disabled people and my mother knew someone from there and he told us a lot of things they don't tell you in school. The Nazis made a lot of scientific discoveries as they tried to create the Aryan race. Basically they wanted tall handsome people with white skin and blue eyes, and they did a lot in order to get there. One of those things I got told was that they knew about the fact that if a woman is pregnant with twins and the blood of one baby gets into the eye of the other while they are in the womb, it could cause a change of eye color from brown to blue. So they made tests on living twin children where they took blood from one and ingested it into the eye of the other with a syringe. Another thing I heard was that especially in Hartheim, where they had a lot of disabled people, they did not see them as living things, so they made practical use of their bodies after those experiments. So they made bags and lampshades out of the skin. Today there is a hospital especially for disabled people in Hartheim, and one of the patients is an artist my mum knew from her childhood. He is painting pictures with his feet and mouth because he can't move his arms. Those are some pretty weird paintings. I try to find them.